I love making burritos, but they tend to be more of a summer food, but today I want to change that. We're going to make the perfect, awesome burrito, and it's going to include refried beans, a delicious squash salsa, some amazing veggies, and much more. But first we're going to make something to season it all with, so we're going to make a homemade Mexican spice mix. You could buy a Mexican spice mix from the supermarket, but it's going to be cheaper and tastier to make your own. So we're going to start with some black peppercorns and some coriander seeds, and we're just going to toast them off in a dry pan for about a minute. We'll then follow it up with a good helping of cumin seeds. Keep the heat nice and low as you don't want to burn the spices. I'm going to be using whole spices and toasting them in a pan to release their oils and aromas before grinding them into a powder. For some spices like cumin and coriander, I find the pre-ground stuff tend to be a bit lackluster in flavour, especially if they've been lounging around in your cupboard for a while. Whereas buying the whole spices and grinding them down yourself, it really packs a punch in terms of flavour. Once the spices have released their oils and natural aromas, we're going to get them into a pestle and mortar and grind them into a powder. There are two ways of using a pestle and mortar. The first is the tapping method, where you're essentially just going to hit the pestle against the spices, thus breaking them up. Sometimes I like to put my hand over the pestle just to stop the spices from flying out everywhere. I'm then going to use the muddling technique and twist the pestle against the spices, pushing down in sort of a circle motion, and that's going to grind them into a nice powder. We'll then add a few pre-ground spices, starting with some sweet paprika, then some smoked paprika, which is a little bit spicier. I'm also going to add some garlic granules, then some sumac, which has a nice tart, tangy, almost citrusy flavour, followed by some dried oregano, and we'll just mix this into the other spices to create our Mexican spice mix. This will be used in a few components of the burrito, such as the squash salsa and the sautéed veggies, but first we're going to make some spiced roast squash. I'm using a squash called Green Hokkaido, which has a lovely orange flesh and it's got a nice nutty flavour, so I'm just going to remove all the seeds and then chop it into large wedges. Some of this squash I'll be cutting into pieces to go into the burrito, and then some of it will be making a delicious roast squash salsa. Always be careful when cutting squash, as it does have quite a firm skin, so make sure your chopping board is secure and you've got a very sharp knife. We're then going to drizzle over some extra virgin olive oil, followed by some sea salt. It can take a fair bit of salt and pepper because squash has quite an earthy flavour. We'll then follow up with a good couple of tablespoons of our Mexican spice mix. Sprinkle it generously over the squash, we'll then massage it in so every bit of squash is coated in that spicy seasoning. I've also added 4 cloves of garlic, which are going to be roasted and added into the squash salsa, which we'll be making later on. Don't try doing this with a spoon or tongs. You want to get hands on, that's what cooking is all about, getting connected to the ingredients. A bit like with the pestle and mortar, I really like to use that instead of a spice grinder. And we're just going to roast the squash for around 30 to 40 minutes until golden and soft. Now that the roast squash is ready, which we'll be using in the roast squash salsa later on, we're going to start with the refried beans. Firstly, we're going to finely chop 1 white onion. Then we're going to finely chop 1 green chili. I wanted to get a jalapeno one, but they didn't have any sadly. I did remove the seeds as I don't like it too spicy, but if you've got a bit more of a spice tolerance, then feel free to leave them in. Put these chilies to the side. I want these refried beans to have a nice garlicky kick, so we're going to add 3 large cloves of garlic, and we're just going to crush them and then finely slice them. You could also zest the garlic if you wanted to, and we'll add this garlic to the chili as they'll be going into the dish at the same time. So get yourself a heavy base saucepan over a medium heat, and we're going to heat up a good couple of tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, and then we'll add in our onions, followed by about a tablespoon of cumin seeds. I love using lots of cumin in this dish as it's lovely, nutty, earthy and sweet, which goes perfectly with the beans. We're just going to cook off the onion and the cumin with a little bit of salt for around 5 minutes until it's slightly caramelized and translucent, and then we'll throw in the garlic and the chili. Fry this off for a minute or two. We'll then add some tomato puree, followed by some cumin powder, because once again I love cumin, and then some dried oregano. Cook this out for a couple of minutes. By frying the tomato puree, it's going to intensify its flavour and bring out all the natural flavours in the tomato. We'll then add in the beans. I'm going to be using kidney beans and black beans. Ideally, you would use some pinto beans, which have a lovely creamy, buttery texture and flavour, which goes perfectly in refried beans. I'm also going to add a splash of mushroom stock, just to loosen it up a little bit. We'll then get in there with a potato masher and give them a good crushing. You can make them as smooth or as chunky as you like, it's totally up to you. I'm going to add a good squeeze of lime juice just to bring out all the flavours, and also a good grinding of black pepper. Recently I've been using mushroom stock a lot, as I've found these really good mushroom stock cubes in the supermarket, and they just add a really nice depth of flavour to your dishes, so I'd highly recommend using it. These refried beans add a lovely creamy and rich element to the burritos, but they're also delicious on their own with some tortilla chips or with some rice and guacamole, so perfect for a quick lunch or dinner. Next up, we're going to make the roast squash salsa. Starting with the squash we roasted earlier, just remove the skin, then some chopped tomatoes. We're also going to add the garlic cloves that we roasted. They're now going to have a lovely sweet and mellow flavour. Then add some chipotle paste. Depending on your spice preference, you can add as much or as little as you like. Then a good handful of fresh coriander, a pinch of salt, and a good squeeze of fresh lime juice. If you don't have a lime, then you could use some lemon juice or some red wine vinegar, just something to give the salsa a nice tang. Pulse this in your food processor until you've got a nice chunky salsa. I don't like to blend it too much, but you can if you want to. We'll then add a few extra ingredients. Starting with some pomegranate, which has a lovely tart but sweet flavour and adds just little bursts of juiciness into the salsa. Best way to get the seeds out is to pop the half pomegranate over your hand and just give it a good old smacking with a spoon, and they'll just pop right out. You can then just get into the bowl and remove any of the white bits, but generally this method works pretty well at removing just the seeds. Pour in your blended ingredients. We've then got one more ingredient, which is optional but adds a nice kick to the salsa. We're going to char one green chili over an open flame, and this is going to give it a really nice smoky flavour. Once it looks like this, just pop it in a bowl and put a cover over it, and we'll leave it to cool. You'll now be able to just peel off the skin. It should come off pretty easily, or you can use a bit of kitchen roll to help scrape it off. You'll then have this funny looking naked chili, which we're going to cut in half, remove the seeds because I'm a bit of a chili wuss, and just going to finely chop it. Mix this into the salsa. It's going to add a nice little bit of heat and some sort of smoky charred flavour as well. This salsa can be enjoyed with tortilla chips, dolloped onto soup, or in this case, it's going to be going into our burritos. We'll now prepare some veggies and tofu, which we're going to fry in that Mexican spice mix. I've got some fennel, some mixed mushrooms, and some green cauliflower. I'm going to cut these vegetables into bite-sized pieces. For the fennel, I'm going to cut it a bit like how you would cut an onion. You also don't want these pieces to be too big, or else they'll sort of poke out of the burrito and end up breaking the tortilla. I'm going to be using produce that is seasonal in the UK at the moment, which is always a good idea because it's generally fresher, tastier, more nutritious, and it hasn't been shipped in from far away, so that's always a good thing. For the cauliflower, I'm just going to cut it into smaller pieces so it cooks quickly and also evenly. I'm then going to just tear up the mushrooms into nice chunks. Don't worry about being too precise here. I feel like you don't really see mushrooms in burritos that often, but I'm not really sure why, because they have a lovely chewy, meaty texture, and they're also incredibly nutritious and have a nice umami flavour. I've then just got some extra firm tofu, and I'm going to tear it into little chunks similar to the size of the vegetables, so everything sort of cooks evenly at the same time. As well as protein, this will add a nice chewy texture to the burrito, as a lot of the other ingredients are quite soft, like the squash and the refried beans. You can of course air fry or roast these vegetables and tofu, but I'm going to fry them with a little bit of olive oil, and we're going to cook them for around probably 10 to 12 minutes over a high heat. You want these to get nice and caramelized because that's how we're going to get the most amount of flavour, so make sure your pan is nice and hot before you add them in. We're going to season them with a little bit of salt about halfway through the cooking, and then we're going to add in that spice mix, which is just going to take them to the next level. You can see how vibrant that spice mix is. It's going to add so much flavour to these, and they're going to be absolutely delicious inside that burrito. I've cooked them so they've still got a slight bite to them because I don't really like mushy vegetables, and we'll now move on to make some lime and coriander quinoa. I'm going to be using quinoa as it's got more protein and fibre than rice. It's also very high in micronutrients, and I'm just going to cook it in a medium saucepan in vegetable stock for around 15 minutes with the lid on. We'll then pop a tea towel over it and leave it to steam to finish the cooking. Once it's beautifully steamed, you can just run a fork through it and that will release all the grains, and you'll have this beautiful fluffy quinoa. You can of course use rice if you would prefer to. We're going to make this quinoa really nice and fresh by adding some chopped coriander and some freshly zested lime. These burritos are great for meal prep as you can just freeze them as they are, and then I always just defrost them and either microwave them and then pan fry them to get the tortilla nice and crispy, or you can just stick it in the air fryer if you've got one, and that does the job as well. And they're great for customizing depending on your needs. For example, if you want to add more protein, then you can add more tofu, or if you want more volume, then you could add more salad, the quinoa, the squash. Maybe you want to gain a bit of weight, then you can add more avocado, and that sort of thing. So there is your fluffy quinoa ready to go, and now we're ready to build the burrito. Personally, I like to start with the quinoa as it's quite dry, and that's going to help prevent your tortilla from getting too soggy. Then I'm going to go in with those delicious refried beans. Then I'm going in with some of the roasted squash. I've removed the skin as it was quite tough, but for other varieties it might be okay. Followed by some of those delicious veggies which have been fried in that lovely Mexican spice mix. Then a good dollop of the chunky salsa to add a bit of freshness and also some spiciness. I'm going to add a little bit of avocado and lettuce because it wouldn't be a burrito without them. You could also add some vegan cheese if you wanted to. And then just roll up your burrito and that is ready to go. But we've got one more step to make the perfect burrito. And that is to toast the burrito off in a pan so it's nice and crispy on the outside and it sort of seals everything together. For me it's an essential step, but you don't have to do it if you don't want to. If you are planning on freezing the burritos, I wouldn't worry about doing this now. You can always do it after you've defrosted them. Another tip I have when freezing burritos is to have the wet ingredients in the middle and the dry ingredients around them. This is to stop the tortilla from getting too wet. Grab yourself a knife, doesn't have to be quite as long as mine, but we're going to cut into this burrito and we're going to get a good look inside at that delicious filling. Packed with flavour, texture and nutrients, these are the perfect lunch or dinner, or even a breakfast, so I hope you really do enjoy. Okay, it's the next day now as I ran out of time, so I just popped this burrito in the air fryer for around 8 to 10 minutes. And now it's nice and hot and has a lovely crispy outside, so let's give it a try. Oh, that is so good. I think if I had to live off one food, it would be burritos. So many different textures inside. The squash salsa has got a nice warm buzz coming from the chipotle and the green chili, and then you get little bursts of freshness from the pomegranate seeds. The quinoa is nice and fluffy, and then you've got the chewy tofu, the crispy tortilla shell, you got the creamy squash and the refried beans. They've got a really lovely earthy flavour from that cumin and also cooking them in the mushroom stock. And yeah, this is a perfect burrito, great for autumn or even winter. If you enjoyed today's recipe using squash, then check out this video for 3 more squash recipes.